Neville Goddard, The Power of Awareness, Chapter 7, Attitude. Experiments recently conducted by Merle Lawrence of Princeton and Adelbert Ames of Dartmouth in the latter's psychology laboratory at Hanover, New Hampshire, prove that what you see when you look at something depends not so much on what is there as on the assumption you make when you look. Since what we believe to be the real physical world is actually only an assumptive world, it is not surprising that these experiments prove that what appears to be solid reality is actually the result of expectations or assumptions. Your assumptions determine not only what you see, but also what you do, for they govern all your conscious and subconscious movements toward the fulfillment of themselves. Again, he's talking about the life of an assumption here. He said that before in a previous chapter. It sounds like it's got its own life if you listen to this sentence. Your assumptions determine not only what you see, but also what you do, for they govern all your conscious and subconscious movements toward the fulfillment of themselves. He's saying that the assumption itself has a life that guides you towards its fulfillment. Over a century ago, this truth was stated by Emerson as follows: as the world was plastic and fluid in the hands of God, so it is ever to so much of his attributes as we bring to it. So it is ever to so much of his attributes as we bring to it. To ignorance and sin, it is flint. They adapt themselves to it as they may, but in proportion as a man has anything in him divine, the firmament flows before him and takes his signet and form. Your assumption is the hand of God molding the firmament into the image of which you assume. Oh boy. We've already said now that an assumption has its own life, and now he's saying it is the hand of God molding the firmament into the image of which you assume, of that which you assume. Wow. The assumption of the wish fulfilled is the high tide which lifts you easily off the bar of the senses where you have so long lain stranded. It lifts the mind into prophecy in the full, right sense of the word. And if you have that controlled imagination and absorbed attention, which it is possible to attain, you may be sure that all your assumption implies will come to pass. Let me repeat that sentence. It lifts the mind into prophecy in the full right sense of the word. And if you have that controlled imagination and absorbed attention, which it is possible to attain, you may be sure that all your assumption implies will come to pass. When William Blake wrote, "What seems to be is to those whom it seems to be," he was only repeating the eternal truth. There is nothing unclean of itself, but to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. Romans 14:14. Because there is nothing unclean of itself or clean of itself, you should assume the best and think only of that which is lovely and of good report. It's a very, very important point. A very important point. Remember, we're talking about attitude. You should assume the best and think only of that which is lovely and of good report. What are you going to get? You're going to give good report, and you're going to get good report. It is not superior insight, but ignorance of this law of assumption if you read into the greatness of men some littleness with which you may be familiar, or into some situation or circumstance an unfavorable conviction. Your particular relationship to another influences your assumption with respect to that other and makes you see in him that which you do see. Your particular relationship to another influences your assumption with respect to that other and makes you see in him that which you do see. Remember, it's your assumption that's the driving force right here. If you assume, remember back to our teacher who assumed the child was doing bad, and the whole school staff assumed the child was doing bad until she went home and did an imagining lovingly for that child. Did she assume something different? That assumption itself drove the pattern home. It drove it home for the girl, and she did better, and she didn't get expelled from school. This chapter should be called Assumption, not Attitude, but it's definitely tied, but we're going to find out here in a minute. If you can change your opinion of another, then what you now believe of him cannot be absolutely true, but it is only relatively true. The following is an actual case history illustrating how the law of assumption works. One day, a costume designer described to me her difficulties in working with a prominent theatrical producer. She was convinced that he unjustly criticized and rejected her best work, and that often he was deliberately rude and unfair to her. Upon hearing her story, I explained that if she found the other rude and unfair, it was a sure sign that she herself was wanting, and that it was not the producer but herself that was in need of a new attitude. I told her that the power of this law of assumption and its practical application could be discovered only through experience, and that only by assuming that the situation was already what she wanted it to be could she prove that she could bring about the change desired. Her employer was merely bearing witness, telling her by his behavior what her concept of him was. I suggested that it was quite probable that she was carrying on conversations with him in her mind, which were filled with criticisms and recriminations. There was no doubt but that she was mentally arguing with the producer, for others only echo that which we whisper to them in secret. Do not criticize thy king in thy bedchamber. Do not criticize the king in thy bedchamber, is where that's from. Repeating the sentence, there was no doubt that she was mentally arguing with the producer, for others only echo that which we whisper to them in secret. I asked her if it was not true that she talked to him mentally, and if so, what were those conversations like? She confessed that every morning on her way to the theater, she told him just what she thought of him in a way here she would never have dared address him in person. The intensity and force of her mental arguments with him automatically established his behavior towards her. Seems natural, right? She began to realize that all of us carry on mental conversations, but unfortunately, on most occasions, these conversations are argumentative. That we have only to observe the passerby on the street to prove this assertion, that so many people are mentally engrossed in conversation and few appear to be happy about it. But the very intensity of their feeling must lead them quickly to the unpleasant incident they, themselves, have mentally created and therefore must now encounter. When she realized what she had been doing, she agreed to change her attitude and to live this law faithfully by assuming that her job was highly satisfactory and that her relationship with the producer was a very happy one. She changed her attitude. To do this, she agreed that before going to sleep at night, on her way to work, and at other intervals during the day, she would imagine, right here, that he had congratulated her on her fine designs and that she in turn had thanked him for his praise and kindness. To her great delight, she soon discovered for herself that her own attitude was the cause of all that befell her. The behavior of her employer miraculously reversed itself, his attitude echoing as it always had done. That which she had assumed now reflected her changed concept of him. In essence, she changed her self-concept, but it reflected in him. What she did was by the power of her imagination. Her persistent assumption influenced his behavior and determined his attitude towards her. With the passport of desire and on the wings of a controlled imagination, she traveled into the future of her own predetermined experience. This was Neville's wife. I don't know if you've heard the lectures, or there's, I think at least 2 or 3 times in lectures he describes this story, and it is a story of his wife, and it's very nice that he gave examples and testimonials so close to home, because I know I know my wife has, my wife does, and I have in myself, speaking first person, carried on a conversation with a boss I had at work, and I was never surprised to hear the same verbiage. This is way before Neville. Hear the same verbiage, a similar attitude coming from my boss towards me, because it was the same argument I would have, trying to have a conflict, I guess. I don't know. I don't know where the habit came from. But listening to the story of Neville's wife, and then listening to the story of her correcting it and having success after correcting it is nice. It's a very nice testimonial in his first-person experience, his world. Thus, we see it as not facts, but that which we create in our imagination, which shapes our lives. For most of the conflicts of the day are due to the want of a little imagination to cast the beam out of our own eye. It is the exact and literal-minded who live in a fictitious world. As this designer, by her controlled imagination, started the subtle change in her employer's mind, so can we, by the control of our imagination and wisely directed feeling, solve our problems. By the intensity of her imagination and feeling, the designer cast a kind of enchantment on her producer's mind, and caused him to think that his generous praise originated with him. It really is fascinating to see somebody say the thing they think came out of them, and in fact it came from somewhere else. Often our most elaborate and original thoughts are determined by another. Often, most profound, the last sentence. Often our most elaborate and original thoughts are determined by another. Often. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful, wonderful example. Here's a last piece by William Butler Yeats. We should never be certain that it was not some woman treading in the winepress who began that subtle change in men's mind, or that the passion did not begin in the mind of some shepherd boy, lighting up his eyes for a moment before it ran upon its way. Wow. Where do these things come from? How is it we're all so connected? And I always remind, as much as possible, that we are all connected. I am all that is God, right here. Here's our self-concepts, yours, mine, mothers, brothers, sisters, friends, relatives, co-workers, doesn't matter. If I have an attitude within myself, then subconsciously I carry that attitude. Into my subconscious network, I carry this attitude. It's plugged directly into all consciousness. All consciousness is plugged directly into all that is, which is plugged into every other stream of consciousness. If my attitude about a person, like in this case her producer, let's say this was her, she had a mental argument with him, well, that's in her subconscious. That subconscious directly goes into all consciousness. That went right into the producer's dream state or subconscious state. And as you know, your waking 3D reality is the echo, it's the shadow of what's happening in the fourth dimension. In her mind, she was carrying on this argument in the fourth dimension. Therefore, it objectified itself in the experience with the producer. But when she changed the attitude, the behavior of her employer miraculously reversed itself. When she started imagining that he congratulated her on her fine designs, and that she in turn had thanked him for his praise and kindness, that's when her attitude changed, thereby causing his attitude to change. And then his attitude was reflecting her attitude. Attitude is a big piece of this. And if you don't if you don't think you're getting what you give, and there's my wife said just yesterday, she says, what comes around goes around. And I says, wait. I says, wait a minute. I says, it's actually, the order is what goes around comes around. And it's speaking of what we're talking about. Neville's wife, the gal in this example, was carrying on an argumentative state of conversation within herself. So she was sending that signal back into consciousness, into her subconscious, which is plugged into consciousness. All that is, I am God. You're sending that back. He is no respecter of persons. He doesn't judge what your attitude is. Her attitude went straight to her producer. And therefore, the next day, he came with the same admonishments or whatever he was not liking in her work, or no praise, and etc. But when Neville thankfully helped her see this other viewpoint, she then could practice it and carry on the praise and carry on the polite attitude. And before you know it, her work's getting praised by him. I mean, that is a wonderful example. So just be mindful what you're carrying on, even within yourself, about anybody else. Your attitude is going to equal what you're going to experience with that person, because you're carrying that attitude straight back into all that is consciousness. Wow, what a wonderful chapter. I mean, wow. We start off with assumptions heavy, but then we go right into attitude, and attitude is a big piece of this. Attitude is also something that is kind of limited to your self-concept. This self-concept here has a range of attitude, give or take, that fits it. Now, let's say she changed to the one of praise, and she became this one over here, the one of praise and very polite attitude with her employer, with her producer. Then she had a most pleasant experience with him. Now then, he's changed into this person. She's changed into this person. Now we have these two people. The attitude within her now has a spectrum. That spectrum is befitting of that new self-concept. The spectrum of attitude she had here, thankfully to Neville, she was able to tweak it to the more positive. It still had a spectrum from the negative to the positive. That same attitude spectrum that exists here, like your gauge on the car, right? Or a gauge of some sort. That same spectrum of attitude doesn't exist here. This is a completely different attitude, because if she then became one of praise for her producer to herself, then this is a completely different self-concept. It has a different attitude available to it. It's not this one. And if she chose to go back and look back, she would go back like Lot's wife, looking back, and be salted and preserved in the past, stuck, having dabbled here and had a great success with her new self. She fell back. That would be the unfortunate thing. You don't want to do that. I think that can happen easily, but you don't want to do that. When you're conscious of this, you won't, hopefully. All right. Power of Awareness, Chapter 7, Attitude. We'll see you in the next chapter.